Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief, your primer on some of the top international news stories of the day. Today we're talking about important verdicts from Thailand as well as the European Union. We're talking about the Poland-Belarus border crisis and we're talking about a war film from the UAE. First up, Thailand, where the Constitutional Court had issued another sweeping order equating calls for reforms to the monarchy to an attempt to overthrow the regime. The ruling, issued on Wednesday, was in the trial of 3 youth activists charged with treason. The court has also ordered activists and groups to halt all activities propagating for monarchy reforms. Activists expect the ruling to become a potent tool for the military-backed government of Prayut Chan-o-cha in its crackdown of the protests. Anish covers Thailand for People's Dispatch. Anish, and he's on the show with us. Welcome back. Tell us more about the case, Anish, and what's going on.
So the 3 activists were charged with treason about last year after their rally in the Thammasat University. And that rally happened in August 10, 2020, last year. And the rally was kind of like one of the first public demonstration calling for monarchy reforms. Protests have been happening in Thailand since I think February, when one of the opposition parties were dissolved. So you had sporadic protests all the time. But at the same time, there were only calls for political reforms or like dismantling the military at best. The monarchy was always never touched, actually. And one of the reasons is because nobody knew how the regime will react to how, whenever some kind of reform is called for in the monarchy. One of the standing points have always been the section 112 of the criminal code, which is the lese majeste. We talked about it in the previous show. In this case, they were calling for like a large-scale reform of the monarchy as an institution itself, because it is the richest institution actually in the country, about anywhere between 50 to 80 billion dollars worth of estates and wealth, completely away from public scrutiny. And at the same time, they have very recently this move was made that they have their own royal barracks, completely under the control of the king, not answerable to any civilian government. So we are talking about an institution that mimics more or less like an absolute monarchy in many ways, but is part of a constitutional system. So in that sense, this case that was filed against them was an attempt to hound the activists. And in the sense, there were other people also mentioned, but these 3 were the ones who had made public statements calling for these reforms. So that is the case that we are looking at right now.
So, and being the Constitutional Court, obviously from a legal standpoint, this becomes like a precedent. And we also saw that after these events happened, the website of the court was hacked into in a sort of ironic protest. So how are movements gearing up to deal with what's likely to follow from this verdict?
So there are like a couple of things here. So obviously one aspect of it is the precedent that, as you say, it is being set, and the Constitutional Court has been quite infamous in this respect when it has dissolved governments, dissolved parties with the simplest of issues. Like the latest was the Future Forward Party, which was dissolved because the president of that party spent his money for a campaign, for an election campaign, which was against the funding limit rules. So it was nothing, big amount. It was not a great deal of violation, but the whole party was dissolved simply because of that. So the Constitutional Court has that sort of history, and it has been doing that ever since it was established in 1997. And it has always very often sided with any kind of coup regime or a military elite that really does not want the sort of democratic push that has been attempted by people's movements for the past 2 decades, and more than that actually. On the other hand, there is also, as you said, like when you pointed out the hacking part, this shows that there is a certain generational gap. So we have to, as I mentioned, the monarchy reforms were something that are new, and the protest movements that have happened, like the protest movement has happened since July last year. The large chunk of that was led by youth movements, students movements, and they were focused. A large deal of it was focused on reforming the monarchy so that there a sort of aspirational thing to become at par with constitutional democracies around the world. So there is that sort of young, maybe at some level liberal seeking aspiration.
Right.
But at the same time, there is also a certain generational shift gap with the older generation of activists who are looking for doing away with the military hegemony that Thailand has always had issues with and containing. And so in that sense, we can see that generational gap coming up even now when the protests are going to continue, but it will be now focused on the Prayut government, the corruption cases against, allegations at least, against them, and also human rights violations and a whole lot of other things. So it will be focused on that, and where it is quite likely that the more established movements and opposition parties will completely avoid talking about monarchy reforms as a whole, because they do not want to attract any kind of prosecution or kind of any kind of judicial harassment to begin with. But we do not know how it is going to be going to affect the movement as a whole, because in many ways the verdict is quite sweeping.
Yeah.
You never know what is going to be criminalized and what is not. So we have to wait and watch what will be happening.
Right, serious questions there. Thanks, Anish, for the update. Moving on now, Google's challenge to a 2017 EU antitrust finding against its shopping comparison service, Google Shopping, has been largely dismissed by the General Court of the European Union. It's an important win for the Commission's antitrust division, which in the recent past has brought a string of enforcements against big tech, including multiple decisions against Google. Prashant, this on the face of it appears to be a case of Google using its SEO supremacy to kind of push its own services ahead of others.
Right.
What do you make of the case, or tell us about the case?
Right. It's like anything antitrust, it's quite complicated. But the basic idea is that a company uses its services or behaves in such a way that it prevents its rivals from being able to function properly. It basically exerts a monopoly. Now, the problem with the monopoly, of course, is that even if the other company's service or a smaller company's service is better suited for you, you will never get to experience it because the bigger company has just dominated the market. So this is a very classic example of what Google has tended to do over the past many years. Now they're saying they're changing it, we'll come to that. But for instance, in this case, what it did was there were a number of services which offered shopping comparisons, which for instance would give you, say, you have a product such as a shoe. Now there were, say various shoes at various prices, right? And you want to compare. Now, Google had this service of its own and various other companies had these services. Now, Google, which operated a search engine, used its search engine to basically privilege its own shopping service, which is something called self-preferentiality, where self-preferentiality is where you use your dominance in one service to promote other products. Right, so here Google is a dominant player in the search engine business. It promotes, using the search engine, it promotes its shopping service. Now, according to the European Union law, this is not per se a wrong thing. On the other hand, preventing others from being able to access customers is a bad thing, and that's what has happened. So in 2017, Google received a huge fine, around I think 2.4 billion euros, if I'm not mistaken, for this issue. Right, and this is the verdict that they appealed, and their loss is appealed. They have one more round of appeal. They can go to the highest European court, which is the European Court of Justice. Now, there were 3 cases in which in successive years Google was fined. This was the first of the fines. The second one, which was close to $5 billion almost, saw the case was around Android. It's Android operating system, which so many of us use across the world. So the case there was that it pre-installed its Chrome browser, the Google Chrome browser, in that Android service, and it prevented many people from having the option of accessing other browsers. And for instance, paid other phone manufacturers or operating system manufacturers to pre-install Chrome. So what basically happens is that Google, through this behavior in terms of monopolies, is able to solve. The third one has to do with AdSense, where again Google Ads were really the key thing. So basically, what the accusation against Google was, which has been proven, which has been declared, is that through its various monopolies, it was able to suppress the possibilities of other companies really rising, and was able to establish this kind of dominance that we see today. Today, life seems to be unimaginable without some kind of Google product or the other.
Yeah.
But the fact is that this is not inevitable. It's not inevitable that Google has become the default, for so many of us.
Yeah.
The was searching online, we call it Googling.
To the web.
Exactly. But that's because of a series of business deals, it's because of a series of business practices. And according to the European authorities, these were all a result of monopolistic practices which are probably against the law. So that's really the case.
Yeah.
So that's where we are right now, and we've seen, of course, now Google will appeal, but these fines together, I think, make up around $9 billion, which is a huge amount, which is a big amount, but maybe for the company not so much.
Drop in the ocean.
Exactly, right.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that seems clear around the world is that whatever else happens, lawyers win. And these kind of judgments have a massive implication, including on industries such as ours, independent news media. But what are the implications for big tech that you might see from this?
Right. On the one hand, Siddhant, the numbers are, like I said, are big. You have billions of dollars of fine. On the other hand, there are two issues. One, like you said, considering the scale at which companies like Google and Facebook are operating, or Apple for that matter, this is really not much.
Yeah.
Okay, because they're not really fundamentally affecting your business, your existence as a company. They're just getting some money out of you.
Yeah.
Now, the fact is, after these cases were filed, Google claims to have worked on some of these issues, and apparently there have been reports that it has changed some of its practices. But the important thing to note is that a lot of this dominance has already been established.
Yeah.
So now the fact that it has reversed some of these practices may be too late. Okay.
You can't turn all that
Exactly.
back.
You can't reverse a monopoly. You can only break it if new companies come up or new sectors come up.
Yeah.
But in this sector, for instance, it's difficult to think of some other new search engine coming up today, because unless Google faces some internal crisis, or in case of Facebook, it's difficult to think of another social media network unless other crises come, right?
Yeah.
So that's really the issue, the fact that one, these monopolies have already been established. So in hindsight, imposing fines, while people may feel good about it, while you can argue that, okay, this proves that Google was wrong, it doesn't really make too much of a difference.
Yeah.
Point number two, the fact is that these take a lot of time. For instance, there are similar cases in the United States as well.
Yeah.
They have not even been heard. So at the amount of time these legal proceedings take basically means that tech companies which are either violating the law, which have been accused of violating the law, they have the flexibility to sort of benefit from these practices, then turn around and say that, what, we are changed now, we're better people now.
Yeah.
And then they'll spend a lot of money on various, say, health initiatives or charity initiatives, and they'll come across as saviors of the world, right? So that's really a big problem. So, if it's, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg has his own charity, for instance, something like that.
Or we saw Facebook announcing when they talked about metaverse, right?
Exactly.
10,000 jobs in the European Union.
Precisely, exactly. So then they get to throw around these kind of sops. So the problem here really is that the real world, or the world of the legal world, is not caught up with the speed of technology. Technological innovation, technological change. And like I said, the important thing to note here is that there is innovation, there is genius, tech genius, of course.
Yeah.
But a lot of this is built on old-fashioned, sly business practices.
Yeah.
And we can't really, we can't forget that. Sometimes when we think of these big tech companies, we think, oh wow, young geniuses doing great work. And there is a great amount of innovation. Nobody's denying that.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of old-fashioned, dirty business practices that are in this thing. And what time and again the legal framework has proved incapable of actually dealing with these issues at the right time. So we'll probably keep hearing more of more fines, more indictments, more accusations. But unless, say, the proposal to break up Facebook, that is something that can fundamentally change the game.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But whether it will happen or not, different question.
Or how it will happen.
Exactly. But fines alone unlikely to really change the nature of the game.
Might not amount to much more than the government getting
Just a
cut.
rap on the knuckles,
Yeah,
nothing
or
else.
that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Fair enough. A crisis is unfolding in Europe on the border between Poland and Belarus. This week, thousands of refugees from across the developing world tried to enter Poland by this border. Poland has detained hundreds of migrants and deployed an additional 3,000 troops on its side of the border. Prabir Purkayastha, NewsClick editor-in-chief, joins us for more on this story. Prabir, Could you tell us a bit firstly about the origins of this crisis?
Well, it does appear that Belarus decided that the European Union was going to talk about human rights.
Right.
Then they have been the cause of refugee problem, at least part of the problem, sending NATO troops to Afghanistan, to which, for instance, Poland was a part,
Right.
sending, again, the US and its allies troops going to Iraq, going to Libya. So if they have caused the refugee problems, and all of these, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, all of this, Syria, for instance, all of these have resulted in very large displacements because, as you know, war is the biggest cause of displacements. In fact, Afghanistan has a huge number of refugees in Europe. That's a war, successive wars in Afghanistan has led to that. So the question that I think Belarus wanted to pose to European Union, if it was such a great supporter of human rights, then how come that you don't want to take refugees, but you'd like to impose human rights discourse on everybody?
Right.
Of course, part of it is also that Poland itself is at the moment in deep trouble over human rights. And the European Union has raised Polish human rights as an issue because of women's rights, abortion, for example, the question of LGBT rights, all of this has been already flagged. So I think Belarus did want to, in this particular case, embarrass the European Union by saying, if you are such a great propounder of human rights, how come that when you create refugees, you're unwilling to take them? Right. And that's, of course, Poland is has itself willing to send its troops anywhere at the behest of the United States. But when it comes to the consequences of that, are going to say, no, we don't want anybody. And there's all Belarus trying to do some very bad things to us. In this case, the refugees are from Syria. And as we know, NATO powers did impose various actions on Syria, supported war in Syria against the Bashar al-Assad government, and the refugees in this particular case are really the consequence of that.
Yeah. So the European Union has come out on Poland's side in this case, even though like the sort of challenging relationship that they have that you mentioned. How do you like sort of view this difference in approach in terms of like disagreeing on some aspects of human rights and then backing their stance on others?
Well, it's an interesting issue again, that what is the European Union's relationship going to be with Russia as well as with Russian friends,
allies,
the very few left in Europe. Belarus is about the last of them.
One.
So if you look at that, then you have on one side that they would like to get countries like Poland and Hungary, which have pretty bad records on the issue of human rights with them, on the issue on fighting Russia. In fact, that's what they see as a strategic challenge. So on that, they're on the side of the United States. They would like to side with this kind of powers, who all of them seem to be traveling towards a very aggressive form of right-wing politics. And Hungary is an example, Poland is another example. We saw in Poland, for instance, the abortion rights has become a huge issue. A woman lost her life because she was not allowed to abort a fetus which was not viable, and they knew that. But till the heartbeat doesn't stop, under law that Poland has, this is not possible. Abortion is not possible. She died. So there are huge protests on that. So part of this also, this European Union's attempt to provide a fig leaf to Poland and get away from the fact that its internal human rights record is abysmal at the moment. And it is acting against the European court also, which has given pronouncements on the LGBT rights issue, penalized Poland. Poland says it doesn't recognize it. I'll be the European Union, but on my own terms. So I think a part of it is to also distract the attention from this issue, which is the human rights issue in Poland, and then focus on human rights issue on the issue of Belarus pushing refugees into Poland. So this, I think, is, shall we say, a sleight of hand by European Union, trying to distract attention from the crisis it has, how to handle right-wing forces who now rule countries like Ukraine, Hungary, as well as Poland. And within the EU, both Hungary and Poland are there.
Yeah.
And they're not the only right-wing governments
at
there.
all. And finally, on Monday, the trailer for the new Emirati movie on the war in Yemen was released and caused a huge amount of controversy. The movie, The Ambush, seems to be focused on the challenges faced by UAE soldiers in Yemen. Yemen, of course, has been described as one of the worst humanitarian crises of the century. Prashant, we've seen a lot of war movies. It's a very, very popular genre from around the world, some good, some bad. What do you make of this perspective from which this movie is being made? And of course, it's being made by a world famous big budget director, Pierre Morel, who's directed the Taken series and all of that. What do you make of it?
Right, it's a bit strange because the controversy is very understandable because you're basically glorifying an occupying army. This is not a war of good versus evil. This is not, World War II where you say, oh, the Nazis, let's fight them. Or this is not, say, any of those. This is not a fight for freedom. This is not, say, black soldiers fighting in the civil war against slavery. This is an occupying army. And now Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and their allies together are directly responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, causing the greatest humanitarian disaster of the century, millions pushed to the brink of starvation, a cholera pandemic. To this day, assaults continuing. And the idea that a movie can be made which talks about rescuing Emirati soldiers from Yemen who have been ambushed by rebels. That really is the heights of, how the media can be misused for these kind of purposes. Important to note that the funding of this comes also indirectly through a state agency which is obviously engaged in propaganda. So, we have seen propaganda war films across the world. Some of them are disgustingly, propaganda-ish. But this one is of an entirely different genre because you have soldiers invading another country and then... But this one is of propaganda to another level because you have invading soldiers being glorified or being portrayed as victims who need to be rescued, and that's really the focus. A similar kind of story I can briefly think of is Black Hawk Down, which again talked about devious Somalis attacking the poor US soldiers. The question was why on earth were the US soldiers in Somalia in the first place? Right, and that kind of... So those kind of devious portrayals still very much there. Unfortunate that a top-ranked director has, agreed to this, but that's Hollywood and movie industry for you. Always willing to, say, culture wash or present a, pretty face for occupation, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I guess the moral of the story is the bigger the budget, the more the questions that we should ask. All right, that'll do it for us on the show today. From Prashant and me, you've been watching Daily Debrief. You can check out more on all of these stories on peoplesdispatch.org and follow us on all the usual social media channels. Thanks for watching. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Goodbye.